Hello, darling viewers. We hope you're doing well. Um, we are back for our Jane Eyre vlog series. As always, I'm your co-host, Sarah Hurley, and with me
I'm Renee Pugh, and I'm Sarah's co-host for the Jane Eyre vlog series.
this week, we've both read chapters 1 through 9, which is pretty, pretty foundational material and context for our protagonist's life, Jane's life. But before we get into a little brief summary and some discussion about the chapters we've read, thought it would be fun to give a little historical and contextual cultural context for the novel and for Charlotte Bronte's writing process, everything that happened around it. So the novel was originally published as Jane Eyre, an autobiography, under Charlotte's pen name, Currer Bell, along with her sisters, Ellis Bell for Emily and Anton Bell um, for Anne. I do remember her name. Um, and it was published on October 19th in 1847 by Smith, Elder and Company of London. It was published in America the next year by Harper and Brothers of New York. It was originally published in 3 volumes, and fun fact, the second edition was actually dedicated to William Thackeray, best known as the author of Vanity Fair, but he also wrote other things. So this novel is it's gothic, it's romantic, it's a Bildungsroman. But when it was first published, even the publisher, George Smith, who edited and published the book, didn't know who Currer Bell was. He'd never met Charlotte Brontë. And whenever they were first corresponding about the novel, after she'd sent it in, he gave her all of these suggestions for edits to make before publication. And she received his correspondence and was like, wow, thank you so much. Actually, I won't be taking any of your suggestions. And then she did, and he published it anyway, which I thought was just super fun and cute. And so he didn't meet her until the novel had already been published, and he didn't realize Currer was a woman either. So super fun history there. Um,
Fun real life plot twist.
I know, plot twist. We're gonna get into sort of Jane Eyre's time at the Lowell School, which was in part inspired by Charlotte's own experience at the Cowan Bridge School for clergymen's daughters. Um, Her sisters, Elizabeth and Mariah, not sure how they pronounced it. Both of them died there, and we're going to talk a lot about all of the illness that is running rampant at the Lowell School, that takes the life of Jane's dear friend Helen Burns, and Mr. Brocklehurst, the sort of curmudgeony, strict old man who's running the Lowell School, was in part inspired by the evangelical minister who ran the Cowan Bridge School, which is it's fascinating to sort of trace these connections between real life and fiction, because Jane Eyre, in several ways, is like a very thinly veiled autobiographical romp through Charlotte Bronte's lived experiences, in part and in part not. Um, but the novel itself had this very deeply internal, revolutionary first person prose. It's very psychologically complex and intense. Um, it really changed the way a lot of people thought about writing first person narration, and these really kind of twisted, unreliable protagonists and or narrators. And Jane Eyre and Charlotte Bronte, she's been called a literary precursor or ancestor to ginormous literary figures like James Joyce, who was the Irish modernist author of the novel Ulysses and the short story collection Dubliners. So really, really big literary impact with this novel, Jane Eyre. So now that we know a little bit about the historical context, we're going to let Nadea, who is reading Jane Eyre for the first time, give a little brief summary. We're going to recap these 9 chapters that we read. Take it away.
They were really fun chapters to read. I'll start with that. I I really had a blast reading them, and I find myself to be someone who sometimes struggles with reading like classics and older works, but it I just felt like I was reading like a modern piece. It was so much fun. But we start out and we meet Jane Eyre, and she lives with her her step aunt. How are they? She's related somehow to Mrs. Reed. Um, who was like a mean woman, doesn't like her. And Jane Eyre lives in the manor, the big house with Mrs. Reed and Mrs. Reed's evil children, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. Um, and we begin we begin the novel and we meet Jane, and I found her instantly very fierce and strong-willed because John is picking on her and being very physically violent, and so she doesn't just let that happen. She kind of pushes back, and of course gets in trouble for this because little orphan, little stepchild stereotypes say that Jane must get in trouble. So then she's locked in the red room, and she has a dream, I believe, like a wild kind of scary dream thing, that I vaguely remember. I read these chapters a couple days ago, but yeah, she has like a a dream, and then the physician from town, or not the physician, the apothecary from town has to come and check on her, um, and says that she basically needs to go to school. So then Jane ends up being sent to Lowell School. That is the name of the school, correct?
Yes, it's the little school.
Okay. I was like, I hope I'm not wrong about that. And she's sent to this school, but when Mrs. Reed sends her to this school, she alerts all the adults at the school, and she tells them that Jane is this evil little mischievous little rotten child. So once Jane arrives, of course, that's what all the adults think of her, before she even has the chance to make her own reputation. Um, but then throughout the later chapters of the 1 through 9 that we read, Jane makes a friend. She befriends Helen Burns, who is noticeably different from Jane. Helen is very, very meek, very quiet, very complacent. When she gets in trouble, which is very, very often, she just she sucks it up and she just deals with whatever punishment. Like there's one moment where a teacher tells Helen to just stand in the middle of the room and everybody can see her and look at her. And Jane thinks that this would be horrifyingly embarrassing. And I agree because I hate being looked at. So standing in the center of the room would be horrible punishment for me. But Helen just takes this punishment and she's like, she sees it as deserved. So I think that's Helen's a very interesting character. And she's older than Jane, befriends Jane, kind of guides Jane throughout like school, teaches her the ins and outs, shows her the ropes, that kind of thing. We meet Mr. Brocklehurst.
Hmm.
Um, he's a
I think
very
he comes to get Jane, and that's when Mrs. Reed tells him, "Oh, this is a wicked child."
yeah, she's she's Jane is so evil, she's wicked, she's mischievous, she's horrible. So Mr. Brocklehurst has this horrible perception of Jane, before he even really gets to know her at all.
Hmm.
And so there's this moment in in these early chapters where Mr. Brocklehurst comes to the school, to just check in, that kind of thing. Um, and I'm looking for the chapter now so I can make sure I'm right. But he reminds me of um Mrs. Trunchbull from Matilda because he shows up at the school and he starts like the some Miss some who not Miss Temple.
Miss Minnie?
Mrs. Someone gets in trouble, um or
Oh,
not
oh,
gets in trouble.
yeah.
But
Uh,
he shows up at the school and he gets upset because the children were served food that they could actually consume.
Mhm.
instead of like the burnt burnt porridge. I can't remember exactly, but instead of the burnt breakfast that he thinks they should have had, and just sucked it up and humbled themselves and eaten. They were served actual edible food. So he's upset by that. He's upset because one little girl has pigtails in, or she doesn't have pigtails in. He's upset about her hairstyle. So
Yeah.
he goes on a rampage about that.
It's too vain, and so he makes all the girls chop off their hair, which I think is an attack on female sexuality, but we can get into that later.
Oh, for sure. Um, yeah, so he shows up and he's very charming, seems very fun to be around. And Jane is trying to be quiet and not call attention to herself in front of this man who she knows hates her.
Isn't it she drops her slate? Is that what she drops?
Yeah, she drops her slate. Um, and so of course this calls attention to her, and Mr. Brocklehurst singles her out. Um,
That's when I don't think she comes in with everybody thinking she's wicked. That is when he tells everybody, oh, like her ward has said she's a liar, she's dishonest, she's a wicked child. And that's where they get this idea that she's not to be interacted interacted with. She's not to be I guess part of their inner circle.
associated with it,
And so
yeah.
this and Jane goes on this crusade to defend herself and prove that she's actually Mrs. Reed was just a terrible person. I didn't deserve anything that she did to me. I definitely am not anything that she says about me. Please don't believe her. Promise I'm a good person. Swearsies. And so she for this, who is the one like actually really nice, sweet teacher at the Lowell school who'd arranged the lunches of bread and cheese when the children's breakfast was inedible. And so Miss Temple kind of rallies on Jane's behalf and does some digging and realizes her story checks out and makes sure all of the other girls and all the other teachers realize that Jane's not a little wicked child. She's just a girl.
She's 10 years old. She's young.
She's 10. She's a child. And then I think the last thing that's really a big part of this section of chapters that we tackled this week was, of course, Helen Burns' illness, consumption, tuberculosis, that she eventually dies from, which is a pretty significant moment in Jane's, at least her early life. It's really formative for her mindset and her ideas on life and death and what that means to a person like her.
I could imagine that if the first friend that I met um died, that'd also be a formative moment for me as if I was 10 years old, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Um
And I think especially the fact that Helen is so accepting of her own death. She seems so ready for it. There was a conversation. Um, I really love Jane's grappling with religion and with God or a higher power throughout the novel. I think it's so realistic. It reminds me very much of Graham Greene, The End of the Affair, Sarah's her like constant struggle between like, okay, God, like, are you there? I know you're there, but are you there? But like, are you really telling me to give up my one true love? Like, I know I've dedicated myself to you, but like, this is terrible. I feel like it's rare to get such a realistic depiction of
yeah.
sort of inner religious turmoil and spiritual conflict. But I love, 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 love the passage for me in my like very ancient copy of Jane Eyre. It's on page 85, but it comes at the end of chapter 9. Um, when Helen says, I'm very happy, Jane, and when you hear that I am dead, you must be sure and not grieve. There is nothing to grieve about. We must all die one day, and the illness which is removing me is not painful. It is gentle and gradual. My mind is at rest. I leave no one to regret me much. I have only a father, and he is lately married and will not miss me. By dying young, I shall escape great sufferings. I had not qualities or talents to make my way very well in the world. I should have been I should have been continually at fault. And then Jane is saying, but where are you going to, Helen? Can you see? Like, do you know? Do you know where you're going to go when you die? And she says, I believe, I have faith, I am going to God. And Jane says, where is God? What is God? And then Helen says, my maker and yours, who will never destroy what he created. And then she continues to like reaffirm her faith and to reassure Jane that it's all going to be okay. And Jane just keeps asking, like, where is heaven? Where is that region? Does it exist? She's so doubtful. And I think that's so realistic for like a child of 10.
Yeah.
I think it's like actually less realistic that Helen is so certain and so convicted in her faith. I just love that whole conversation that they have because this is such a foundational moment in Jane's life.
Yeah, I have underlined the line towards the end of that. God is my friend. I love him. I believe he loves me. Because it's so simple, but it's so like faithful.
Mhm.
And then Jane's just so questioning of it. Like, is this real? Does he exist? Does he care about me?
Yeah, I love that part too. And then when they say good night at
Good
the end,
night, Jane. Good night, Helen.
but like it's so sweet because they don't say goodbye. You know, Charlotte easily could have written goodbye, but she didn't because they do have this hope that they will see each other again because of their Christian faith. And Christian values and Christian faith is it's a very strong moral undertone in this novel, kind of pervading throughout what's good and what is Christian and what does it mean to be Christian and how does Jane's belief and her perception of belief change over time.
Yeah, I'm excited to see kind of her character evolution because she is such like a strong-minded female protagonist, which I feel like I could just be wrong, but I feel like that's rare for 19th century literature to have a female protagonist like this who's so
Mhm.
passionate about everything she thinks.
Yeah, she was really controversial at the time with Charlotte's, well, Kerr's early readers. Um,
Mhm.
she was not behaving as a young lady ought to behave. She was scandalous. This was not a model for um, young women to be looking at. Young women should not be reading this material. Um, which I think is so fascinating because now we're like, oh yeah, she rocks. She's like
Yeah.
fighting and fighting for freedom. She says later on in the book, it's a very, very famous quote. I am no bird and no net ensnares me. Like that's such a like, I guess 21st century feminist sentiment. Um, so yeah, it's interesting to see how her strong will plays out. Um, and how ideas of it have changed over time. But I think it's really interesting that we point out her strong will and her strength and her independence and her fiery temperament, all these things that make her so wonderfully juicy and complex, but she's also sort of fueled by this horribly intense need for love and for validation. I think some of the moments that really stuck out for me um within these chapters were kind of early. There's one part where she's got this doll and I think it's pretty like raggedy, but she has this like super like deep depressing quote. She says, to this crib I always took my doll. Human beings must love something, and in the dearth of worthier objects of affection, I contrive to find a pleasure in loving and cherishing a faded graven image, shabby as a miniature scarecrow. Like she is so desperate because this is back when she's still at um, the Reeds mansion, and nobody
Let
loves
her
her.
know it.
She doesn't have anybody to love. She's a child lacking any sort of basic human connection or intimacy. And then we sort of see that coming back towards the end of our section of chapters. I think in chapter 8, she tells Helen, um, they're talking about like she's like, I think the world hates me. I think God hates me. And Helen's like, calm down, girl. Um, and Helen says, if all the world hated you and believed you wicked, while your own conscience approved you and absolved you from guilt, you would not be without friends. And then Jane says, no, I know I should think well of myself, but that is not enough. If others don't love me, I would rather die than live. I cannot bear to be solitary and hated, Helen. And like, once again, she is literally 10 years old, which is a crazy thing to be saying when you're 10. But I feel like that is so human and so real. She's just so desperate for love because of how she's been treated as a child in the Reed's household. And I think that also shapes a lot of her experiences and a lot of her choices going forward in the novel, which, I mean, like, I already know, but you will discover.
Yeah, I think it shows too because, like, her desire for love to be liked as well, because I feel like being loved and being liked are two wildly different things.
Mhm.
But when we have the whole moment where Mr. Brocklehurst is kind of denouncing this character that she's built, because she's built herself up at the school as like an intelligent young woman. She's not causing too much trouble yet. um, but then he comes and tears this down, and she's devastated because she thinks that everybody's just going to hate her forever now. Um, so I feel like it shows in those moments too, where she's so desperate to prove her merits, to prove herself, to be respected, to be liked, to be loved.
Absolutely. Oh, what else did you really want to talk about um, for these first few chapters? I have a few things in my mind, but since you've not read it yet, I kind of want to hear like what stood out to you the most.
The physical abuse in the beginning stood
Yeah.
out to me a lot because I've grown accustomed to reading like Jane Austen as of late. Um, and there's a lot less physical violence in Austen versus we opened this novel and there's like
Hmm.
it's it's brutal.
Yeah, it's like first 2 or 3 pages.
Yeah, it's like I'm looking for it now, but it's so instant and jarring. Or it was jarring for me at least to just see like this brutal violence in the opening pages as well. It's not even something that's built up to. It's just it's here you go. There it is.
Absolutely. And I think that really continues, it changes forms when she goes to the boarding school. Um, but some of the administrators there, and definitely Mr. Brocklehurst is they're all really terrible. I think especially in the
Yeah.
scene where they're like singling girls out and like humiliating them as a form of punishment. That's definitely mental and emotional abuse.
Yeah.
And especially I think the scene where they're like, okay, we're gonna cut off all of your hair now. Like
That's
that's
psychological torture. Cutting a
that's
girl's hair.
definitely a tactic. And it's very similar to what happened when, like Native Americans were forced into American assimilation schools. They would cut off their hair as like a form of humiliation and like forcing them to adhere to like like white culture, like white American values. Um, it's like very similar. They're like, these girls that we're not raising them to indulge in luxury. We are raising them to be self-denying and humble, and we are raising them to be like decent ladies who can serve others and completely deny themselves. And that's really tragic. And I think abuse comes in a lot of different forms in this novel that maybe aren't quite as overt as those opening pages.
Is that another thing, do you think? Or I guess have you found, and because I know you've done some research, that was like scandalous upon the novel's publication? All this physical violence, physical abuse, mental abuse.
Yes, I believe so. I mean, I've read, it was scandalous for like a lot of reasons. um, like kind of depictions of, yeah, like physical violence is like one of the really bad things. And I think it's also like sexual violence, rape, just like controversial characters, depictions of certain like racial ethnic groups, I think. Just like a whole like smorgasbord of the ideas that pop up in this novel were so like just like ugh, we don't talk about this. We are Victorian gentlemen and ladies. We don't talk about this. Um which of course makes it all the more fun and spicy to look at and think about now.
Yeah, I love I don't know. There's something so fun to me about like a novel that when it was published was so scandalous and so such a cultural phenomenon, and then now we look at it and we're like, yeah, we like this a lot. We like this book and the themes that it addresses.
Right, and I think even with Jane Austen's novels, which were, relatively tame, we're not seeing this like horrific violence playing out really on the page. Maybe, some behind the scenes, there's some questionable things. Thinking specifically with like Willoughby's whole situation, there are some questioning things going on, but we don't really see them as they're happening.
Yeah.
Um, but even like in terms of reception, Lizzie Bennet was not much admired as a character back in the
Really?
olden days when she came out. She was considered very crass. Like she was not behaving like a lady should, to refuse these proposals, especially like to refuse Darcy's proposal. Like she is not honoring her family. Like she's
No.
not doing the right thing in her situation. So she wasn't particularly well liked for the reasons that we love her today.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think reception studies are super cool. I was super interested in a discussion of like different sort of not necessarily like contemporary, but other literary works from around the same time period within the novel. The one that really stuck out to me was Gulliver's Travels, which Jane would used to read from the Reed Library. She said, I considered it a narrative of facts and discovered in it a vein of interest deeper than what I found in fairy tales. For as to the elves, having sought them in vain among foxglove leaves and bells, under mushrooms, and beneath the ground ivy mantling old wall nooks, I had at length made up my mind to the sad truth that they were all gone out of England to some savage country where the woods were wilder and thicker, and the population more scant, whereas Lilliput and Brobdingnag, please pardon me, being in my creed solid parts of the earth's surface, I doubted not that I might one day, by taking a long voyage, see with my own eyes the little fields, houses, and trees, the diminutive people, the tiny cow, sheep, and birds of the one realm, and the cornfields forest high, the mighty mastiffs, the monster cats, the tower-like men and women of the other. Um, and I think it's so fun that Jane is sort of falling into this fictional magical land and getting so invested in it when that's something that Charlotte and her sisters did too. In their youth, they created this sort of paracosm, this magical fictional land that they made up stories about. I think it was called Angria. I think if I'm remembering correctly, that was their like paracosm, little like magical, fantastical fantasy world that they envisioned and wrote stories about and like wrote volumes and volumes of lore for this place, this fantasy land. So I think it's so fascinating that Jane is using fiction as a means of escape, and um, that's how she's sort of escaping the abuse that she was facing in the Reed household by escaping to the island of Lilliput through Gulliver's Travels, which was a real novel at the time that Jane
Mhm.
Eyre could have been reading and certainly had read. Um, but I think you had mentioned earlier, whenever we were talking about the novel, you noticed an instance where I think they referenced Pamela, which I did not catch in my recent read through.
Yes. It's in like this on the second page, I think, of my it's very early. It's in chapter 1. I can try and pinpoint it now. but yeah, I noticed that and I was like, it was an interesting choice for me, or to me, I guess. It's on my page 3 of chapter 1, so it's very early in there. Um, yeah, as interesting as the tales Bessie sometimes narrated on winter evenings, when she chanced to be in good humor, and when, having brought her ironing table to the nursery hearth, she allowed us to sit about it, and while she got up Mrs. Reed's lace frills and crimped her nightcap borders, fed our eager attention with passages of love and adventure taken from old fairy tales and older ballads, or, as at a later period I discovered, from the pages of Pamela and Henry, Earl of Moreland. And I thought it was an interesting choice because I know Pamela's a novel about morals, right? And it's kind of it's like not instructional, but
Isn't it about a woman that gets seduced? And I haven't read Pamela, and I don't know very much about it, but I was in a class once, um, and the professor, brilliant genius professor, Dr. Shona, my beloved, my thesis advisor. She's so cool. She's my academic hero. Um, but she said we were talking about something unrelated. We were talking about a novel, and now I can't remember the title of it. I think it was they had written anyway, it had a different title, but like on the spine of the book, it was called Lydia, which was the name of the title character. It was like a very, very thinly veiled autobiography of an escaped enslaved woman in the 19th century. Really, really fascinating. I think also a recently recovered novel that we sort of that was sort of lost to history for a while. But we were studying it and we were trying to think of like why they might have put Lydia on the spine instead of the actual title of the book. And she was saying, and I had compared it, I was saying, well, it kind of reminds me of like in the 17th century, like Pamela, Evelina, Carmilla, all of these novels that just have a woman's first name as the title. And I think she made a comment about how all of those novels are about a woman who somehow ends up being seduced and like faces the consequences for that, and how that might have impacted the way that publishers and or the author wanted people to sort of think about that book, at least at first whenever they're first going into it, to just go into it with those connotations. um that was a completely random side tangent that nobody needed.
we love side tangents here. We love them. They're always appreciated. Um, yeah, no, I Googled Pamela because I was looking for like a kind of just summary
Yay!
of, and it's it's an epistolary novel by Samuel Richardson. The full title is Pamela Virtue Rewarded, I believe. I just lost the page where it told me the full title now. Pamela or Virtue Rewarded. And it follows Pamela Andrews, a 15-year-old servant, who, on the death of her mistress's son, Mr. B, begins a series of strategies designed to seduce her. So it is about seduction, and Pamela resists these advances and is later rewarded for her virtue. So I thought that was an interesting choice, for like
Yeah,
as a
so
story
weird
for
that Becky is
Jane to
reading
be
to
learning.
like an 8-year-old.
Yeah, she's just like, yeah, if a man advances, resist and you'll be rewarded. Like, thanks, but I'm 8 years old. Um, I just love when a protagonist is a reader.
Mm.
Um, and that's the way we meet Jane, is just she's all about books. Like, she gets in trouble because she's in the library, and that's where John finds her and decides to pick on her and talk about, these are my books, blah blah blah. But she's like, well, they're more mine really because I'm the one actually reading them. So
So true.
I love her for that. She's a reader.
I think we see that carry on through her school career. Not only is she a reader, she's an academic, you know, she's getting these, I think it's French lessons. She's taking French.
Yeah.
She does so well in her classes. She's allowed to like do art now, and you like study more advanced subjects. She likes school. She does really well. She's a reader, she's a writer, she's a Renaissance woman, and we love her for that.
Me too.
now that you've heard our conversation, what do you have to say? Do you have any thoughts, feelings about these first 9 chapters, about, the context, the historical or cultural context in which Charlotte Brontë was writing? Do you have any ideas, if you're reading it for the first time, any thoughts on where the novel might go? Be sure to leave a comment in the YouTube comment section.
Or on the blog page because it's this you can watch this there as well. Both places. So let us know what you think. Let me know if anybody else knows if Matilda has any sort of reference at all to Jane Eyre that I might not know of because I haven't read. I'm obsessed with this connection because that's all I could think of in the beginning was just Matilda. And maybe it's just like the kind of orphan, unloved child type stereotype. But I kept thinking of Matilda. So if anybody knows more about Matilda than I do, please let me know if Roald Dahl was thinking of Jane Eyre when he wrote that. Please let us know any other thoughts you have, even if they aren't Matilda related.
All right, so I think that wraps us up for today's discussion. We'll see you next time on June 17th, covering chapters 10 through 17.
And until then, happy reading and viewing. Do both!